Okay, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order today, October 11th, 2022. This is our work session for the month. And at this time, I'll recognize our county manager to walk us through the work session items.
County manager, could you hand me my purse right there? I need to turn
Lord
it.
have mercy.
I laid it
Where's
down
that?
right there. I need to turn my phone off before it interrupts our meeting. And thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman,
I forgot.
could we take about a 15-minute break for her to get ready?
That was my fault, Gail. I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault. I love to see you. Anyway, thanks. Okay, I'm ready.
Ready?
It's on.
Okay. All right. Okay. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, what I'd like to do to start the conversation off, you can see from the agenda, we're going to have quite a bit of conversations today in regards to our opioid settlement funds. And so what I'm trying to do is just go through initially just a little bit of history. I'm not going to go through all the information that's previously presented, but it's really going to help if somebody watched this video or read these minutes. It's really just going to give a full summary of where we've been and where we're at right now in regards to discussions for the opioid settlement funds. So what I do have first is the link to the information provided to the board at the August 9th meeting. If you recall, this was the actual wording of a lot of the information that was disseminated in regards to the memorandum of agreement and things of that nature. So if you look at what was originally presented to the board, we did put together a table of contents. Ultimately, as you scroll through the table of contents, it just provides some background information in regards to the opioid settlement dollars. Talks about what is the memorandum of agreement that we refer to quite often in our conversations. Discusses a little bit about how much of the funds do go to the counties versus the state. Provides information as far as the amount of funding, the $3.2 million over the 18-year period. And then ultimately gets to how should the counties and cities spend their settlement funds? And as you can see, it refers to an option A or an option B. And that's where I'm going to stop at this portion of the presentation, because ultimately this board has chosen to try to move forward and get educated in regards to option A strategies. But I highly encourage people to go back, if they want to know details about option A and option B, to go back to this link. To let the board know and the public know, we are going to develop a single resource page. And in this single resource page, what we're going to do is provide links to all of this previous information. So anyone from the public can go through and they can get as much detail or little detail as they want in regards to the progression of these conversations for the opioid dollars. So as you can see, if you continue on past that, it really gets into the actual wording of the memorandum of agreement of what option A is, strategies, and what option B is. So I'm going to back from there and go to the next presentation that's presented to the board, which was September 6th. And this is in regard to, this was an Association of County Commissioners PowerPoint that I'd asked them to modify a little bit to meet what we were looking at. And when you go to it, it really goes over somewhat the same information as the detailed information that I just previously went over with you, but it's in a PowerPoint slide format. And so as you can see, it does talk about the association's involvement. It does talk about Nidhi Sachtiva that they've hired at the association to provide resources to counties. Talked about goals of the association. Talked about supportive services from the association. Also talked about the allocation of the funds. We do talk about our 18-year payment schedule again. One of the things I do want to focus here is the Mma Guiding Principles, because you will hear these probably often in future presentations, is spend the money to save lives, use evidence and data to guide spending, invest in prevention of root causes, focus on equity, and include people with lived experience, and transparency and accountability.
Is that in our notes? Is that right there?
No, sir. This is in previous presentations. It's not in that book, no, sir. I just didn't want to reprint everything that's already been handed to you.
I need a copy of that.
Okay. And so if you go to the next slide, It does refer back to the options A and B in regards to these are the options that are available for how the board can expend these funds. As a reminder, this board is moving forward again with the option A strategies. So then that's where I come back to, we have focused on this slide quite a bit in our conversations. So I know I quickly went through the information, but what I'm trying to do is just catch us up to where we are today. And so now the board has decided to focus on option A strategies, which in this slide shows the 12 strategies that can be funded with our opioid settlement dollars. And what we're doing today is we do have Dr. Zen here, who's the medical director for VIA. And Dr. Zen is going to present, and this information is in your packets, Commissioner Deeds. I'd asked Dr. Zen to talk to the board about, first of all, starting a little bit basic in regards to opioids. What are opioids? What is the addiction of opioid? So we can get this on record, get it memorialized, and so everybody's talking about the same issues in regards to opioids. But I also asked Dr. Zen to talk about evidence-based addiction treatment methodologies. And so what you're looking at is he will focus also on number 2 on these strategies. And then you will see that we have Dr. Kopak here, which specifically Commissioner Woody had previous conversations with and wanted to invite here. And Dr. Kopak, when I sat down and met with him, as you all know, when he was a WCU professor, the county actually received some grants to assist him to do research on the legal system and judicial system and substance abuse. And so he is considered an expert in regards to legal system diversion, addiction treatment, and reentry programs. So that is numbers 10, 11, and 12 of the 12 strategies that this board can focus on. So that is today what we're going to talk about is 2, 10, 11, 12. We'll probably, these things are not just mutually exclusive. As you go through and have questions, sometimes we will transition and talk about some of these other items. Their expertise does go a little bit beyond what I just described to you, not a little bit, a lot beyond what I've just described to you. So, none of these are mutually exclusive, but we are focusing on 2, 10, and 11, and 12 today. So that's quickly getting us to setting up for our first presentation, which is from Dr. Zen from VIA. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, are there any questions? I'll just try to give us a little quick history of where we're at and where we're trying to go.
And this may be a totally unrelated question, but based on today's presentations, but our clerk gave me a phone number to call with Attorney General Josh Stein's office, and it was my understanding that he was wanting to speak about opioid settlement. Was that?
I think they want to meet with you or some of the other commissioners.
Okay, so I didn't know if any other conversation had been had yet about particularly maybe what the Attorney General's interest or what his reasoning is, how he plays into a part of this conversation.
Okay, I'll have to follow up. I don't.
And I got 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
They may be naive questions. Have we got any money yet?
Yes, we have.
And
Like first 2 things.
that's one.
Show that chart.
That's the first question. So we have.
Yes.
And are they any way that we can do something right this shortly to alleviate some of this stuff in this county with some of that money? Is that naive? I mean, we got people dying every week from some of this. We can talk about all them 12 things there, which is real good, and we got to, and we're talking about how many years we're gonna work on this?
So
7 years?
So I think this could be.
Well, what I'm saying is,
Can I stand here and name off programs that you want to fund at this point? The answer is no. What I'm hoping to do when we go through a couple of these presentations is for the board to come back, and let me go back and pull this chart back up. bear with me. When we look at these 12, this is where we have to spend the money into these 12 areas. So as we go through and present this information to the board, this is what I thought the board strategy wanted to be, because the board wanted to have input instead of creating a committee and immediately coming back with recommendations. I took it from the board. We wanted to go through this process. We present, bring people to you, experts to you to present their information. And then at the end of this, what I'm looking from the board is, where's your interest in these 12? Meaning, after you've heard this information, I am looking for the board to talk about, well, do we wish to look at legal system? Do we want to do early intervention, evidence-based addiction treatment, those types of things? And once I get that direction from the board, that's when I can come back to you and determine what group needs to be formed to try to develop those strategies. But I've been developing the process to set you up to give us direction. I thought that's what we were attempting to do.
And I know Commissioner Striblin and I have had this conversation in the same vein of what you're saying, Commissioner Dietz. And I know we feel this urgency to try to do something, because it is, very much a real thing. It's happening on a daily basis in our county. But these dollars that's a part of this settlement are very restricted, and this is a big picture thing that we need to be doing some big time planning to think about how we have impact, not just right today, but this will be lasting impact over the next 18 years. Now, if there's things or strategies or things that we could be useful, we could use other dollars and other funds to help do those things, but we're going to have to identify those. I don't think it's something that today we can just say, well, we're going to do this and it's going to solve our problems. But I understand what both of y'all have said, but
I understand completely what you're saying.
But the focus of this today is
Yeah, I
long
understand
term.
completely what you're saying. We're all yearning for something to help some of these people,
Correct.
you know? And if it's something that we can use any money to do something, and if I knew what that something was, like write a book, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. That's why we're doing this. It's such a complex thing.
Yeah.
All right.
And I'll be honest with you, and that's why I really felt like it was important for us to go through this process to understand. I'll be the first to admit, I don't know everything about opioids and the crisis and what's involved and at play. And for me as a leader in this community, to be able to spend these dollars in the most efficient and effective way to make the biggest impact, I need to understand it better.
I agree.
And that's why hearing from these
I
folks is going to be very important.
Yes, ma'am.
Would you mind showing that slide again? It went through real fast, but I read it online, and
Which slide?
Well, I'm going to tell him. The one that shows Jackson County's money and that graph of how it's being spent, how much we're getting and when. I think this is real important for people to see, because no, that's not it.
That's not it?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, well, it looked different on the, Okay.
So
that's
we've
fine.
received the
There was
125?
another one. Maybe it was in the other, when I was looking at it at home. But anyway, the thing that I think really helped me to understand the importance of this planning is that to sustain any effort that we decide on, we need to be able to see that this money is a lot for the first 4 years, and then it goes down, and for 18 years. So we're getting, when we see that as a county, we're getting $3.2 million dollars. It seems like, wow, that's amazing, and it is. But we all know that 144,000 in 2039, so we really have to be strategic, and I think that's what you're alluding to as well.
To just one more comment so we can get back on track here. To take what you just said and take it a little further, to be strategic. One of the things as a member of the VIA board here regionally, we have talked about is there are ways that we're going to have to partner together with our other local jurisdictions, our other counties, because some of this stuff, what we might determine after going through this learning process, we might determine this component is the best thing that we can do for our community, but we can't do it alone.
Right.
And that's where we're going to have to need Macon and Haywood and Swain and Graham and all these other counties partnering with us to pool our money together in some aspects possibly, to approach it from a broad perspective where we're working together. Because it's not just our problem, it's a regional, it's a statewide, it's a national problem. So that's why I think we got to keep that in our minds as we work through this strategies.
So to expand on that, so the Southwestern Commission, our Council on Government, has now worked with Swain County. Swain County actually received I believe a $300,000 grant, planning grant from Dogwood to help with planning of opioid dollars. It's now been decided that that grant would be potentially transferred to the COG, and the COG, Russ Harris, is now starting a regional planning process that also includes VIA and Shelley, a regional planning process to start looking at what exactly you just stated, Brian. And so our COG is starting that regional process. We're actually trying to develop we're trying to get all the managers on the same page where we can have the first meeting. And so ultimately, one of the things I've stated earlier, this process here is going to help in the regional conversation, because once we go through this process and the board's educated and you can start as a board start talking about what you believe you are interested in and proceeding forward with, then that helps give some direction to me and staff when we participate in this regional process about is there opportunities regionally for us to actually achieve some of these goals. So all of this is lining up to coincide at the same time. So, and this is what I'm going to recommend all counties do, is to have some type of internal prioritization process so that we know that when we're sitting at the table with 7 counties, then we can start identifying like priorities where regionally we might be able to make it some type of difference. And then the final thing, another value of this conversation is this is getting more conversations to take place. And going back to the statement, Brian, that you made earlier, this funding will be utilized however these planning processes unfold, meaning you give a priority, the staff comes back and tries to accommodate or come up with processes for those priorities, or goes regionally. Well, we're also going to have our annual budget process. And so we already have what I consider, for lack of a better term, low-hanging fruit opportunities that we can have discussions about in regards to our human services agencies, social services, in regards to our jail settings, things of that nature, that hopefully as we go through this planning process and the budget process, maybe the opioid dollars will line up with this. Maybe it's a priority this board chooses to move forward with outside of the opioid planning process. And we won't know all of that until we finish all these plans.
Have we received that summer of 22 funds, opioids? So we've got a little over 400,000 or
Well, our second payment was $142,133. So today we've received $267,000.
267.
I had a call from Commissioner Tommy Long from Haywood County, specifically asking if we were considering a regional initiative, because they're starting a conversation on that as well in Haywood. And then Commissioner Ronnie Beal is working to see if Macon County will also be willing to do that. So there are some conversations.
Yeah. And there's a specific directive that Russ Harris has just literally started in the last couple of weeks that is specifically about trying to coordinate a regional conversation.
We have so much interaction among our counties, so that's a good thing.
Okay. So our first presenter is we do have Dr. Richard Zinn. He's the Via Health our Chief Medical Officer. And again, I requested him to appear before the board to just educate us a little bit about the opioid use disorder, and then also talk to us a little bit about evidence-based treatment, because these are things that you're going to consistently hear in other presentations as we bring other people to you. So, Dr. Zinn.
Thank you, commissioners, and thank you, Don, for inviting me. It's great to have this discussion. It really is. It's such a problem that we face right now in our communities and urban communities, rural communities. There's no exceptions to this. This is ever present. So you know a bit about the opioid settlements. I won't go over this in any significant detail, other than to say that really the commissioners, the Commission of County Commissioners, did a wonderful job of pushing this money more to the local level. In many states, the settlement money is just going to the state, to determine how it's spent. So it really is getting to where it needs to be. So that's a real opportunity. At the same time, I think taking a regional approach, we'll talk maybe a little bit more about that, does make sense, because there are economies of scale of doing things regionally that do make some sense. So again, I don't think I'll go into detail there. We've seen the option A, high impact abatement strategies, and these are kind of broad categories, and these are things that can be done relatively sooner, including that first part, the collaborative strategic planning, which really is kind of the thing that starts it all, to be able to do that planning to figure out the best way to utilize the money. The option B strategies are much more complicated. There's 26 kind of bigger strategies within 9 different categories, and that's separated out into, I think, something like 124 specific recommendations, but they really fall under the broad categories that are in option A. So as that collaborative strategic planning takes place, you can look at more specifics that may apply, specifically to Jackson County. Okay. And at the same time, this does kind of dovetail with the North Carolina Opioid and Substance Use Action Plan. We're now in version 3.0. Version 1 came out in 2017, and version 2 in 2019. And I just kind of show this slide to show that these principles really go along with a lot of the principles that we'll be talking about in the opioid settlement strategies. A couple things of importance. There's a focus on equity and lived experiences. Historically, particularly opioid use has been criminalized. A lot of people with opioid use disorder are in incarceration settings. We'll hear more about that later. And if anything, it's been particularly true of communities of color, that rather than getting treatment, they tend to be incarcerated for the problem that they have, for an addiction problem. So it really doesn't do any good and puts them at risk down the line when they get out, because they have just furthered their psychosocial problems by being incarcerated. So that's important to know. Prevention. How can we prevent this from happening? This is something that I think we really need to be looking at more. How do we particularly with kids that suffer from trauma, how do we prevent them going down this road, going down this pathway? For many kids, they may not have a lot of opportunities available to them. And when their brains are hit with these substances that are so powerful, they really don't see any other choice, and they have a hard time kind of adjusting to that. So prevention, addressing trauma, and supporting children and families is really crucial. Harm reduction and moving beyond just opioids to address polysubstance use. And we'll talk a little bit more about other substances like methamphetamine. I mean, it's a huge problem in Western North Carolina. In many ways, I think it's as much of a problem as opioids. And now they're together. Now, the problem is fentanyl is ever present, and it's mixed in with methamphetamine. So people, are hit with a double whammy of really powerful addictive substances, pretty consistently. So we can't really address the opioid crisis without also addressing other substance use problems, including methamphetamine. And then the care connection, increasing treatment access for justice-involved people, expanding access to housing and employment opportunities, and at this point, recovering from the pandemic. And we'll see numbers in just a minute that really show that this exploded as a problem during the pandemic. The isolation seems to have really done that. And so here we see a little bit of a snapshot of the numbers and how much it's gone up. So these are deaths, overdose deaths, and how they've progressed over time. Going back to 2000, it was a problem, but not nearly as much, and stayed relatively flat, kind of gradually increasing. Jackson was a bit above the curve for a while, and then kind of right parallel with the North Carolina curve. It kind of took off certainly in 2020 with the pandemic, but Jackson, has exceeded that over the last few years in terms of percentages and numbers of deaths. So from an annualized overdose death rate, it is an issue out here, as it is in many counties.
Can I ask you a question about this chart from 2008 to 12, except for one little bump? We had a decrease. Do we know what was going on here in Jackson County that led to that decrease?
So I don't. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think in general, there was a recognition of the problem of opioid use over that time.
Okay.
We were starting to see more heroin, on the streets and prevalent, but we hadn't yet started to see fentanyl. When you look at these last few years, that's a result of fentanyl, being so prominent and being around.
So the stark increase in, I guess, 2015,
Yeah.
where you
15.
jump way up there to 2016, that is because of all of a sudden the availability of fentanyl in the market.
It is. Yeah, it was heroin and then fentanyl. I think 2015, 2016, that's when it really started getting more prominent and more available.
Do we, this substance use, from these deaths, does that include like alcohol, alcohol poisoning or something?
So this doesn't.
Substance?
This doesn't. I don't
Oh,
think.
it doesn't.
Yeah, I think this
Okay,
is more
just-
specific for opioid overdose deaths.
Okay.
And this is from 2021
Yeah.
too. This is last year.
Yeah, so we don't have the 2022 data yet.
It's probably
Yeah,
going to be even worse.
it's probably going to be even worse. I think, unfortunately, you're right. I think you're right. But you bring up a great point, because alcohol, we talk about opioids, but alcohol is still the number one kind of substance
That's
killer.
why I wondered if it's,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
sometimes we kind of ignore that, but it's a big concern.
Absolutely.
Underage drinking, that's a big problem.
Yes,
What's the county with the highest level?
Oh,
it's right here.
It's a good question.
And you know what
It's
that-
Graham County,
Yeah.
Robeson, Bladen, and Pasquotank. Yeah, those are the highest.
And some of it is
This is 2022.
right in the lower populations. If the percentage, it doesn't take that many to increase the rate when you have a lower population. Okay.
What's the average?
So the average annualized is 35.8. So that's the North Carolina. Yeah. Okay. Oops. Okay. So let's start a little bit more kind of with some of the basics. What is an opioid? And we used to call them opiates. You might have heard that, but now we've started calling them opioids. And the reason for that is opiates are kind of the naturally occurring opioids specifically. So those are morphine, opium itself, and then there are kind of some that are naturally derived, or what are called semi-synthetic opioids, like heroin actually is derived from morphine. And then we have the synthetic ones, like fentanyl, which is purely synthetic. It's not a naturally occurring substance. It's something that is now manufactured. So these are a class of drugs found in the opium poppy plant that work in the brain to produce a variety of effects, including pain relief. That's why they're there. I mean, that's why we started, prescribing them. That's why doctors prescribed them, to try to relieve pain. It was very well intended and well meaning. Um, Having practiced, going back into the late 80s and 90s, I saw that happening. And I saw the drug companies detailing some of these medications, and saw even the American Medical Association kind of buying into the idea that people shouldn't be in pain, and that pain is the fifth vital sign. It always struck me as a little funny because the other vital signs like heart rate and blood pressure and respiratory rate, those are objective signs, right? Those are things that we can measure. But a pain scale is subjective. And there are plenty of people that kind of dismiss pain, and there are plenty of people that kind of may exaggerate the pain response, through no fault of their own, really, but it is a subjective thing. So it always seems a little funny to me, and I think to others. So a lot of us kind of saw this happening, and as an addiction psychiatrist, I was concerned about the degree to which these medications were being prescribed. I remember seeing one young man who had suffered a pretty traumatic event that occurred, and then developed a pain syndrome that was clearly related to the trauma that he had. But he saw a pain specialist, a fairly prominent pain specialist in Manhattan, and was getting prescribed, I think at one point it was like 560 milligrams of methadone and something like 1,000 milligrams of OxyContin a day. I mean, it was. If any of us took like one tenth of that, we would probably be dead. But his tolerance was so high over time that he was on that amount of meds. But that was the mentality of, you have to treat this pain. It was completely missing the boat. And as I tried to work with him to help him identify the trauma, he would endorse that and realize that, but he was so habituated to these medications that it was very hard to make any movement with it. He didn't really see it as a problem. He saw the pain as the problem. So this really is kind of what brought this forward, and it's why the settlement has occurred, because the drug companies really did kind of benefit from this. So, but what these medications do is they block pain signals between the brain and the body very effectively. They also make some, maybe most people, feel relaxed, happy, and a little bit high. Not everybody. Some people actually get nauseous and anxious. Some people don't tolerate these medications at all, and they may be at less risk for developing dependency on them. But for many people, they get that feeling. I remember a patient that I treated. It was really sad. This was a woman who was a wife, mother of several children, very religious woman who had a dental procedure, and she was probably depressed, but didn't really recognize it as such. But looking back at it and getting her history, there was some depression there. She got put on pain medications just for this procedure afterwards. Got a 30-day supply, which was also something that used to happen. You don't 30, like a 30-day supply, which you don't need. There's no reason that somebody would need a 30-day supply for a dental procedure, but she got that. And what she told me, after the fact, was pretty much right from the first dose. She said she had never felt that good before. She felt normal by taking this, and she didn't even really know what she was taking. Like, she didn't have a good understanding of what it was. It wasn't like she was sophisticated about it, and that's what struck me about it. It was like somebody who was really kind of naive about it, but just started taking it and got habituated to it. She got her brother to prescribe it. Her brother was a doctor, and her brother, kind of kept it going because she said, I'm still in pain. I still need more pain medication. And, at the 3 to 4 to 6 month point of taking these, she was very dependent on these medications. And then her brother cut her off. and said, I'm not giving you any more. And she really didn't have a valid reason to be on these medications. And she actually got so anxious and depressed that she tried to kill herself in a pretty significant way. That's how she came to my attention, just in an inpatient psychiatric unit. But what struck me.
Million questions.
Well, what struck me about it was just this wasn't a woman that was going looking for it at all, but it kind of happened. And if she could get so powerfully addicted to it, it felt to me like anybody could, or anybody was vulnerable to that. So
I was given some pain medicine, and the doctor said, "Get this, you'll need it." Now, you're going to need this. Well, I wasn't in much pain, but my wife said, maybe you better take one, because
Right.
for some reason, if you don't, if you can keep the pain down rather than let it get to a high level, and then this is true, and the Lord knows it's true. I took one pill, and I slept. It knocked me out, and everything. And but I had nightmares and dreams and everything else.
yeah, that's right.
Now the next morning, I thought, Lord God Almighty, I don't know about that. And I got them things and took them right to think. No, I didn't take another one. 3 nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I was wanting one of them pills. I had it on my mind. I've got to get one of those pills, and I did get them. I took them to the commode and poured them down on the commode.
Good.
Never touched one since. But it scared me to death to think that maybe somebody could get hooked just taking something one time.
So there's data now that if somebody takes it for longer than, and the data varies a little bit, but it's probably about 5 days, that you really run the risk of continuing. That the rate of people continuing with opioids then really increases. So that after a year or 3 years, many people who took it as long as 5 days continued with something. They continued on pain meds when they could get them from doctors, or then transitioned to something like heroin later on when they couldn't. So these things are very powerful. They're highly addictive. They're natural in some ways, with coming from the plant, from the poppy, but they're highly addictive. The things that aren't so natural, the synthetic ones, are even stronger, and that's part of the problem that we're running into now. So what we know is that personal history and length of time using opioids plays a major role in terms of whether somebody develops an opioid use disorder. So if somebody has a history of depression, anxiety, and probably just a family history, some of it really is just kind of our biological makeup in terms of how our brains are wired, can play a role in terms of whether they're likely to get an opioid use disorder or not. Some of the hallmarks of addiction are basically an irresistible craving, out of control use, kind of compulsive use, a preoccupation with it. I can't get it off my mind, just thinking about it all the time, and continued use despite consequences. With other drugs like alcohol, some people can get away with using it and using it fairly heavily and still function to some degree. Functional alcoholics, we've heard that term. With opioids, there actually are people who can do that. The problem is with some of the opioids that we have, heroin and fentanyl, it becomes such an addictive pattern because they're short-acting. They don't last for that long. So it's like a quick onset and then it drops off. And, what does somebody, what do their receptors want? They want to be satisfied again. So it leads to using it again and again. Okay. And that, when we talk a little bit about the medications that we use for opioid use disorder, that's relevant because the medications we use don't lead to that. They actually smooth it out, which is helpful. Okay.
Does this also, is that, that law of diminished return come into play because the first dose does not create that high, they need more or something?
Well, the first dose creates the high, and then you kind of keep chasing. It's like the subsequent doses don't quite do as much.
Okay.
And so you may need to use a little bit more, may feel you need to use a little bit more to get that same effect.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's, correct me if I'm wrong, that's where fentanyl has, because the inability, talk about that is why fentanyl becomes so dangerous, correct? I mean,
It is, yeah.
because you can't really regulate.
You can't regulate it, and by the time you get to, when you start using more, you're at doses that can cause respiratory depression, and and kill you. That's the problem. It doesn't. The fancy term is therapeutic index. Kind of the difference between what would be a therapeutic dose and a lethal dose is not all that much. So it doesn't take that much for somebody to be close to, taking a lethal dose. And these really do. They trigger powerful changes in the brain. They trigger release of endorphins, and those are our body's natural feel-good neurotransmitters. When it wears off, it feels uncomfortable, and people don't want to feel uncomfortable. That's the withdrawal piece of it. So that leads to the desire to get that good feeling back. And over time, that the body doesn't produce as many endorphins in response to it. So it's kind of like chasing it as a result of that tolerance. So these really are tricky medications, to deal with. When somebody is in chronic pain, the other kind of deceiving thing, and this, looking back at it just from a medical perspective, this is probably the most disappointing thing. There was not good evidence supporting the use of these medications for chronic pain. They work acutely. They work for cancer pain. They work for musculoskeletal pain acutely too. If you have a broken bone or an injury, they work and they help. But over time, for somebody who has, say, bad arthritis, these medications could be prescribed for that. Over time, the pain is really no better, but the effect that you have is actually just kind of chasing your tail with it. And if anything, the pain gets worse over time. It's like it causes increased pain sensitivity, by taking these medications over time. So it turned out not to be very effective, and that's the type of data that we finally, got, in the 2000s, and that led to some of the changes that have occurred. Okay. Other things that are important and related to substance use and abuse. Again, vulnerability due to family history and one's own life experiences, trauma, is definitely pertinent. And then psychosocial determinants. The biggest one, maybe social isolation at the end there that we see. And I think that was probably a big factor in COVID. When the pandemic was at its worst, people feeling more isolated and just disconnected and kind of disenfranchised from others, that if they were vulnerable, if somebody came and said, here, take, I got this stuff, this will make you feel better, it was pretty easy for somebody to say, oh, what the heck, let's do this, and to get caught up in that cycle. Stigma, discrimination, unemployment, housing difficulties, all the usual psychosocial determinants that we know that are associated with both substance use disorders and actually with mental illness. And then access and availability. Part of the problem, the supply chain with some of this stuff actually is pretty, it's better than some of the other supply chains that developed during COVID. Some of the problems that we had with other things during COVID. This stuff is pretty readily available, which is frightening.
Just a question on this, on that last slide. Let's say that a young person, I'm thinking prevention, has a sports injury.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a musculoskeletal
Right.
pain. Is there something they can take besides an opioid that would alleviate that pain?
So there's data supporting, believe it or not, this can sound very simple, the use of a combination of ibuprofen,
Yeah.
Motrin or Advil, and acetaminophen, Tylenol. That combination probably works as effectively for most pain.
Okay.
Maybe not the real acute pain for the first couple of days for significant injuries. So there is a place for these medications.
One day.
Well, less than, 5 or less generally. For some surgeries with the type of healing that can be painful, it may need to be longer. But we need to do a better job of being very careful, when somebody's on these, and at some point, kind of ripping off the Band-Aid, and making that transition to things like ibuprofen and acetaminophen. And we haven't done that, because we haven't wanted to see people in pain. So doctors haven't done that all that effectively. But we're much more mindful about it. Now, what I will say, though, is, when the pendulum swings, it sometimes swings a little far. And the problem with that is if people get pulled off these medications, remember, their brains have been affected. So their receptors have changed.
Okay.
It's not like, oh, okay, I'm fine. I just stop it and it's fine. They're going to be craving this, and it's not just a willpower issue. It's their receptors that are powerfully, wanting this thing that's been so reinforcing to them. So that's what shifted a lot of people to heroin in the late 2000 teens or mid 2000 teens. When they couldn't get their prescribed pain medications from docs. So, I think most docs did a pretty good job of addressing this, getting people down to reasonable milligram equivalent doses of morphine with their pain medications, and then making efforts to taper and to use other strategies. Some maybe ripped off the Band-Aid a little too fast for people who've been on these medications chronically, and the risk is, at least for some, that may get them looking for other medications. So we don't see OxyContin out there as much, on the streets, but what you see now is fentanyl, which is no better. So let's shift and talk a little bit about what does the evidence suggest in terms of treatment. So here's the problem. We still don't know what works so effectively for opioid use disorder. What we do know is that the best strategies that we have in terms of saving lives and in terms of functioning over time is medications for opioid use disorder. We used to call this MAT, medication-assisted treatment, and you'll still hear it referred to as MAT, and that's okay. But it's shifted a little bit to be called MOUD, medications for opioid use disorder. And the reason that shift has taken place is because the medication-assisted treatment makes it sound like medications are just kind of assisting the other treatment. And it really is the medications that seem to be effective. And the other treatments actually can assist the medications. So psychosocial treatments, counseling, therapy, even 12-step type of approaches can maybe assist, but in and of themselves, they don't work all that effectively. So, and I've adapted this from a Mayheck presentation that is on the opioid settlement works website. So we'd encourage everybody to take a look at that. It's much more detailed about some of these types of things, about evidence-based treatment for opioid use disorders. But what we know is that the primary medications, buprenorphine and methadone, the rate of adherence to these medications, and that implies that somebody is staying reasonably stable, is around 50%. Okay. For naltrexone, and we'll talk a little bit about these medications in just a minute, naltrexone is a blocker, so it doesn't satisfy the opioid receptors, but it blocks anything else from working there. That rate is a little lower. It's hard to get people on naltrexone. It works, but hard to get them on. The rate of adherence for detox and then abstinence-based strategies, including counseling, is low. People don't do that well. It'd be nice if they did. It'd be great. It just doesn't seem to work all that well. That's what the data shows over and over again. So when we talk about other treatments, besides medications, there just isn't the data backing it as strongly. They can work to assist the medications and to keep people in treatment, and that's important, and to address other issues that somebody may be struggling with. But it's not going to help the opioid use disorder so much itself, generally.
So just to clarify, on like, for example, methadone, you got 43 to 53%, and that percentage means
That they're adhering to the methadone a year later and staying reasonably stable.
Okay, so if, let's say, an individual who is becomes addicted to opioids, and then through whatever means is trying to get off of this addiction, and so they're going to use one of these MOUDs, and so they're on methadone. They get placed on methadone to help them with their addiction. How long, generally speaking, does someone have to stay on methadone?
It's a good question. The best answer I can give is indefinitely, generally. Now, some people can detox slowly. I used to.
This could be a lifelong problem.
It can for many people, because when they try, they just don't do as well. And others can. Others can gradually and slowly taper off methadone. One of the programs that I used to be involved with was what we called the Methadone Detox Program. It was outpatient, and it was designed to be, I think, a 6-month program. That's what it was supposed to be. But the success rates that we had for actually detoxing people, even in 6 months, and that sounds like a long time, right? It was actually pretty low. That the people who did best were those people who actually maintained and stayed with it. Functionally, they did best. They were able to work, families, and continue. So.
Is that because their brain chemistry has changed because of the drug use?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, I think it's just that they're
Like a diabetic would continually need insulin.
Yeah.
Is that similar or not really?
Yeah, no, I think it's similar.
The concept.
The concept that it is not something they can help.
Right.
It's not something that they can control.
And I think that's where this whole stigma thing comes in.
Right.
Yeah.
People just don't understand that, as Commissioner Woody has stated, that the brain has changed, and they no longer have that ability to just, I'm going to quit cold turkey and walk away. No, that's not an option.
So another just kind of an anecdote of a patient that I actually treated him for 20 years, I think. And he never wanted to take methadone. He just didn't want to be on methadone. He was hooked on heroin. Never shot up, which was probably good in some ways. Worked for Verizon. Was when I was up in New York, and he would go up into the Bronx, and even when he was on the job, and get his drugs and use them. He had a family, had a wife and kids who he was very devoted to, and knew he had to get clean. He went into a residential program, like a long-term program. I think he was there for close to a year. And it took him that long to even kind of half stabilize. And then he ended up taking Naltrexone, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is that blocker. And he took it. He took it every day. He took it religiously. His wife made sure he took it. And he took it for 20 years. If I asked him 20 years after he'd been clean for that long, if I took you off Naltrexone, if you didn't take that, do you think you would use? He goes, yeah, I'd be right back up in the Bronx. Scoring. That's how powerful it was for him. But he was motivated, and he was somebody who was as motivated as could be, because he really, he didn't want to lose his wife, didn't want to lose his family, stayed functioning. But for him, he knew he had to do that, and it was hard. And he had a lot of support. He really did have a lot of support with it too. So.
What was he taking? What did you give
So that was Naltrexone, and I'll tell you what.
What side effects of it?
So. Not a lot. I mean, sometimes a little stomach stuff. If you take it too soon and you've been using other opioids, it triggers withdrawal. That's the problem. It's hard to get people on it because it triggers withdrawal. And some people feel withdrawal symptoms even if they've been off of opioids for a while. So that's the negative. It's hard to get people to take that medication. It's a good one if people will take it.
So, or endorphin. I don't know.
Yeah, I can't say that either. That's why I was using methadone a few minutes
What
ago.
is the brand name of that?
So buprenorphine has several brand names, but the one you hear the most is Suboxone.
Suboxone.
So
everybody knows Suboxone.
Right.
So what I want to talk, because your next slide, and Dr. Zen, I don't want to jump in front of
No, it's okay. I'm taking a long time. I'm sorry. Yeah.
this is how it's helped me really understand in very layman term. Go back to the previous slide.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken, you really, if you put as far as how it impacts your receptors, methadone would be first, then Suboxone would be second, and then Naltrexone would be third.
Yeah.
Meaning the amount of how much it's actually either duplicating.
Well, number one is fentanyl, unfortunately, in terms of how it affects. But yeah, yes.
So, real simply put, because this next few slides is really what triggered my understanding this. And Suboxone, that has it been a game changer? That particular.
So Suboxone has been a game changer, I think, in a lot of ways.
Because people focus on methadone.
Yeah.
But I just want to jump to about this, and my understanding, everything I've been sitting through has been somewhat of a game changer.
So
you use the words functioning.
Yeah.
I should say functioning alcoholic, but like if you're dealing with substance abuse, the addiction the rest of your life, this has shown to be a drug that allows people to be functional.
Correct, and there are many people functioning well with Suboxone.
I've seen
who are
people
prescribed
The
Suboxone.
same as this buprenorphine.
That's so. What's
It's two different things though. Functioning alcoholic is still drinking.
true?
Or on meth, on this stuff here, they're not doing drugs anymore.
They're not.
Blocker.
If it's working, if it's working, then they're not using anything else.
Right.
Now,
I'm not trying to compare it apple. I'm just trying to get us thinking in terms of it allows you to be
Yeah.
functioning and still deal with addiction.
and the other thing about Suboxone, so methadone, it's been very helpful for millions of people. I mean, it really has. But it's a tricky medication. It doesn't interact well with other medications. If you take too much of it, you can die. I mean, you can overdose on methadone, and people do and have. So it's dangerous. So it's highly regulated. That's why we have the opioid treatment programs with methadone, where people have to come and get it every day. With COVID, we were giving take-home doses a little bit more liberally, and honestly, there were some problems with that. Although most people did just fine. But it's a trickier medication. The advantage of Suboxone, of buprenorphine, is, and I know this is a complicated kind of technical slide, but I put, having it here, I think it does help kind of explain the pharmacology of it. It's what's called a partial agonist, meaning agonist means that it activates the receptor, right? Antagonist means it blocks the receptor. So, and think of these drugs as like people jockeying for position, almost like a musical chairs, and trying to get to the receptor, right? To bind to that receptor. So it blocks other opioids well, Suboxone does. So it gets in there. When it hits the receptor, it kind of activates it. So people get satisfied some, and it kind of, satisfies the cravings to a large extent, but it doesn't, if you take more and more of it, it's not going to have more of an effect. It kind of blocks itself at a certain point. So that's the partial part of it. And it blocks other stuff. So that's good. That there's no need to take too much of it. It's not going to do anything more if you take more of it. The other good thing is it's got that long half-life, 24 to 36 hours. So instead of being like heroin or fentanyl, where it's like doesn't last that long and you got to chase it, and you're kind of constantly getting that effect and then going into withdrawal, it lasts. And when you're taking it every day, it stays pretty stable. So that there isn't as much of a need for taking other things. It can displace other opioids, which can precipitate withdrawal. So if somebody uses this too soon after taking something else, they can go into withdrawal. So that's why we have to be a little bit careful about it. But it stays on the receptor a long time. So and that goes along with the half-life to a certain extent. So it just is more stable if somebody's on this. It's a more stable way of approaching it. And it can be given and prescribed by doctors as long as they have the training to prescribe it and what's called the DEA X license to do that. So even a lot of primary care doctors are able to do this and get the training. So, and that's, you may hear of OBOT, office-based opioid treatment. And that's something we would encourage more of It's hard. Primary care docs being able to do this is not easy, but it's the access, right? Because there's so many people with these problems. Not everybody can see a psychiatrist or a psychiatric prescriber. So the more we can get this to primary care docs to be able to prescribe this, the better off we are. And some of the good, kind of more sophisticated pain specialists early on, even before the opioid settlements and stuff, they were switching people over to Suboxone because it's just more effective. It stabilizes the pain, more so than some of the short-acting, even pain medications, which can also lead to some of that up and down type thing.
Before we leave this page, if you're going to distribute methadone, there's a whole licensing, there's a whole permitting process that it should be difficult because of the type of drug.
Yeah.
This is very important what he just said, that primary care physicians and other medical providers can provide this type of treatment. So as we start planning for future, priorities and how we're trying to assist in this area, access to treatment is a big conversation. And access, you got to have providers to have access to treatment. So having multiple providers, people who are capable of providing this treatment, could be part of a game plan. I really want to focus, because there are a lot of counties and communities that are focusing on this drug and the next drug versus, methadone has its place. I'm not taking that away, but if I'm correct, they're focusing on this drug and the next couple of drugs because of the ability to provide.
It really has been a game changer. Now it's got, like everything's got their negatives, right? So Suboxone itself is actually a combination of buprenorphine and naloxone, and we also know naloxone is Narcan. That's what blocks the receptors and can revive people after they've had an overdose. The reason naloxone is in Suboxone is it doesn't do anything in and of itself. It doesn't, when it's absorbed sublingually, and that's how Suboxone is given. People kind of hold it under their tongue and it kind of melts in the mouth a little bit. It doesn't actually even get into the system when it's absorbed that way. But if somebody were to melt it down and inject it, so if somebody injects buprenorphine, they can get a high because it gets up to the brain fast, and so they can get that momentary high. So the reason that naloxone is put into the Suboxone form of that is to block the buprenorphine if somebody injects it. So if somebody takes it properly, it doesn't do a thing. The naloxone just goes right through you. But if somebody melts it down and injects it, the naloxone blocks the buprenorphine from having too much of an effect, and from somebody maybe being able to even overdose if they took too much of it too fast. Okay, because anything if you take too much of it can be a problem.
Sure.
So that's the pharmacology of Suboxone, and that's the zone part of it is the naloxone. Okay. So,
Do
sorry.
we know how many providers in our area can
We do.
provide treatment?
Here in this county specifically, Meridian Behavioral Health and the Blue Ridge Clinic and Appalachian Mountain Community Health Center, which is Blue Ridge and Appalachian Mountain Community Health Centers are called FQHCs, and they do primary care as related to behavioral health. They do the MOUD, they do outpatient therapy, and Appalachian has what they call peer support specialists. We also have several providers in Haywood County, where RET is very available, and then Dr. Holmes out of Macon County and Haywood County as well. But you do have providers here. But as Don said, you want no wrong door,
Yeah,
right? You'd love to have more doctors, physicians who went through that training to be able to do it.
So
But you have that.
there's no wrong door, and we'll hear later. Sorry, I'm taking up a lot of time, but part of it is getting people started in the right circumstance. How do you get them started right when they need it and then get follow-up as soon as possible. That's the challenge. There are providers, but getting them started when they're open to it, whether it's an ER or an incarceration setting, sometimes that's the most effective way of dealing with it, is getting them started when they're the most vulnerable so that then they can continue.
That would
Okay.
be life-saving,
Yeah,
Dr.
yeah.
Zan.
No,
if
that's-
those, the ERs and the detention centers had that available.
So just a couple words about methadone, a couple more. So methadone is a full agonist. So that means it is an opioid. The advantage of methadone, though, is it's longer acting. It stays on the receptor longer. It blocks most other opioids. So when people are on the right dose of methadone, they don't really have a need to use anything else, theoretically, at least. And it stays on the receptor a long time. It smooths things out, so there isn't the need to be taking those short-term type of opioids to get that high. However, it can cause significant respiratory suppression and potential respiratory arrest and overdose. And it's not that therapeutic index isn't that high, so we have to be careful with it. That's why it's so tightly regulated and why we have opioid treatment programs. And I put the slide as QT prolongation. That's something related to the heart, where it can make somebody more vulnerable to an arrhythmia. And other medications can do that too, and sometimes there can be interactions with other medications. So it's a tricky medication to use. But again, for some people who are who have kind of the worst forms of addiction, it can be maybe more effective than the buprenorphine because it just satisfies the receptors even more.
This is maybe a simple question. I mean, but I don't understand why methadone is an opioid. Why is that better than taking fentanyl?
Because
Heroin.
because the fentanyl gets up to the brain really fast and comes off the receptor really fast. So it leads to that pattern, of getting high and then going into withdrawal,
Okay.
getting high.
Okay.
And the methadone just kind of leaves it like this, so it's
So
kind of,
people can function more normally.
Yeah.
So that's the difference.
that's the difference.
Okay. Thank you.
That's really it in short, is that people can function with it. They can go in early in the morning, get their dosing for the day, and function the rest of the day. Okay. And buprenorphine is similar, but they can actually get a prescription for it, take it themselves, and works that way. So naltrexone I talked a little bit about before. It's a blocker. It's actually similar to naloxone, so it's similar to Narcan, but it comes in a pill form. It actually comes in a long-acting injectable form called Vivitrol. And you know what Vivitrol is used for? What it's FDA approved for?
No.
Alcohol use disorder.
Oh.
So, and the principle behind this is kind of what we're learning about addictions more and more, is that there's kind of a common pathway to addictions. They activate the same type of receptors. So the way Vivitrol works for people with alcohol use disorders, it kind of blocks the high of the buzz of drinking. So that if somebody's getting the long-acting injectable form once a month, or if they're taking the pill form of naltrexone, they drink, it's kind of like, I don't get the buzz. So rather than having that sixth beer, stop at 2, and maybe I won't even have that because I'm not getting the same effect out of it. So it's interesting. It can work for opioid use disorder too if you can get people on it. But it's actually on the market for alcohol use disorder.
I'd like to point out that chart to the right. This is really that's the reason at the beginning I said I really ordered methadone, Suboxone, and then naltrexone. That's how you have that ordered in your chart.
Right. That's what you're talking about.
So you look at the methadone, that is a real replacement of the opioid, right? I mean, to some extent, as far as the receptors. I look at the Suboxone, the buprenorphine, I cannot say that word, that's sort of, and I'm going to butcher the medical side of this, but sort of the halfway. What you're saying is it can help with craving, it can help with the real cravings, right?
Right.
Of the cravings of the opioid, but it's not a true substitute of the opioid. And then that last one, it completely blocks off,
Right.
right? So the reason that doesn't work, it doesn't eliminate the cravings.
It
right?
doesn't. And so for a lot of people, they're just not as motivated to take it over time.
It's not as motivated. So that, even though that blocks all the receptors, and in essence, it's the same as Narcan in the sense that it helps you from overdosing, it doesn't actually necessarily always cure it doesn't
I mean,
solve the
if
cravings.
somebody, it doesn't solve the cravings. I mean,
So
over
that's the
time, if
reason.
somebody takes it, like the patient that I was describing, he did fine. He didn't have the consequences of his opioid use. But, if you asked him, did he really feel better and feel cured? Yeah, he didn't.
So I guess I go back, and I've sat through quite a few seminars. This is the reason I was asking them to come, because I've sat through many of these Zoom meetings of these types of presentations. And that right there, I would refer everybody back to that little chart that's right there, because it really becomes up to the physician and the psychiatrist, whoever you're going to decide the appropriate treatment, correct?
Right.
Whereas the middle right there is a game changer, because it can be distributed by more people, more types of physicians and so forth.
And it is a balance. It isn't as it's not as much of an opioid as methadone, and methadone is kind of dangerous. Methadone used to be given as a pain medication too. Doctors can prescribe it for pain, but it's got problems associated with it. Yeah. So yeah.
You go back and try to look back into that, really helped me understand these three types of services or treatments that can be provided, because we will have conversations about different treatment methods potentially being made available to people, and that's going to play into these conversations, is the type of treatment.
So, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, but I'll get there on the slide. On this next slide.
I had an in-law that was in treatment for alcoholism and was given antabuse when he left,
Mhm.
and as long as he took it, he was fine. It made him sick when he took it. Is there something like that for opioids that makes you sick if you do it?
Nothing. No, not quite. I mean, the closest thing actually is the Naltrexone.
I see.
It doesn't actually make you sick. Well, but it can give you withdrawal. I mean, if you are taking other opioids, it gives you withdrawal. So that's the closest thing.
Okay.
But yeah, no, good question. That's good. So some other things. There are some newer forms of mostly buprenorphine that actually could be interesting. Sublocade is a long-acting injectable form. So instead of having to, get prescriptions, you come in for a shot once a month, and that kind of gets into your system gradually, so that that may turn out to be an effective way. The problem with Sublocade right now is it's really expensive. It's a brand, and it's expensive. There's even something called Probufene, which are buprenorphine implants, where they're put under your skin in your arm, and they kind of slowly release the buprenorphine. But that's a surgical procedure, so not everybody's going to want to do that, of course. And then the long-acting injectable naltrexone that we talked about is probably underutilized, but it's growing some. I think we're a little bit more aware. It's just hard to get from point A to point B to get people with that. So in terms of other therapies, they are important, actually. It's not as though they're not important, but they tend to be important in terms of assisting the medications. So for people on buprenorphine, there was always a requirement for people to also be in therapy, to be in counseling, psychosocial treatments, not just on the medication alone. There is some evidence that even the medication alone is probably better than nothing. So if somebody can't make that commitment, it may still be better to, for them to get prescribed the medication rather than nothing. But the therapy can also help with the medications. It can help support the medications. It's a little bit how I think of, treatment for depression and anxiety, that medications can help, and, counseling therapy helps too. And it's important. So I don't see it as too much different from that standpoint. And some of the types of therapies that we do, contingency management basically is like paying somebody to stay clean. If you have a clean urine, I'm going to give you a gift card. And believe it or not, it can work. It can be effective. It can be like a little bit of an incentive for somebody if they're kind of on the border. Cognitive behavioral approaches, like really looking at somebody's thought processes related to their substance use, or their behaviors, what triggers their use, and kind of changing those strategies. Family approaches are often really important to keep in mind. And then treating other conditions, other mental health conditions, other substance use disorders, even including nicotine. We used to, in the field, we used to think, well, don't worry about smoking. It's the least of somebody's problems. They kill them, but not right away, compared to the other stuff. But actually, there's some newer data that if we also work on the nicotine use disorder at the same time as other substance use disorders, they're less likely to relapse with the other substances like opioids. So actually, this may be a change that we'll be seeing more in the field. We're actually going to be trying to do that. Sorry, bad with my phones. Okay, and treating depression, anxiety, PTSD, trauma, very important. And this is kind of a whole list of evidence-based strategies for preventing opioid overdoses. So if we want to look at ways of saving lives, all of these are important. They're going to be a focus, I think, of other talks, so I won't go into all of these here. I still put MAT rather than MOUD here. But some of the approaches that we know are effective. And the one I'll highlight down at the bottom is initiating buprenorphine-based treatment in emergency departments. There was a good study out of Yale that showed that was pretty effective. But what's crucial with that is you have to have somewhere for people to go right away for treatment. That's the challenge, is being able to build a system that has that availability.
Right away, someplace to go. Is that some type of structure in your home life or a facility?
So it may depend a little bit. That those who are somebody struggling with housing, then having that type of place to go is really important, or someplace just to go for follow-up treatment, like right away. So that they can get prescribed the usually buprenorphine and continue with it. Rather than just getting a few days from an ER, but really being able to continue it.
What are 9/11 Good Samaritan laws?
So that is if two people are using fentanyl and shooting up, and one of them uses a bit too much and falls out and is unconscious, if the other one calls 911 and we get an emergency response, as a good Samaritan, that person wouldn't get arrested for substance use.
Okay.
So, because if you don't have that, then it may dissuade people from actually calling in an emergency. And it's been found to actually be effective. So some of those strategies are a little more controversial. Things like that, or things like syringe exchange programs for people that are using. Understand them, that they're more controversial because it kind of feels like, kind of enabling this stuff. But if you look at the data, they can actually help to keep people alive. And some of the good things about this, like the syringe support programs, is over time, people may work with people with opioid use disorders to get them into treatment. That may be a way to gain that trust and to kind of destigmatize and kind of de-shame them a little bit. There's so much shame associated with these disorders that actually leads people to keep using. So if we can kind of get past that, sometimes we can get people into treatment. Okay. So some of the challenges. The comorbid addictions with stimulants, particularly methamphetamine in our area. And honestly, this is a challenge that I think is really, really tough. The methamphetamine is horrible. Having worked at Mission and seen the effects of it, on Copestone, wow. I mean, it really does a lot of damage. When you combine that with fentanyl, it's tough. I mean, I really do feel like, they've kept one step ahead of us in some ways with some of these things. These are really powerful drugs. Fentanyl itself is all over the place. It's in the methamphetamine. In the cities, it's in the cocaine now. It's easy enough to manufacture and put it into these other formulations, and it just adds another addictive component. So if you're a drug dealer, if you want to get somebody back, why not combine two things? It's terrible, but it's there. We're also seeing it in pills. That people, if they buy pills online, they think they're buying Xanax, but they're actually getting something that has fentanyl in it. And we've seen overdoses, with these pressed pills that are fake pills. They're not legitimate brand prescriptions. They're pills that are manufactured, and they often have fentanyl. We also know that there's a problem with overdoses with other centrally acting medications, including something like gabapentin, which, again, gets used a fair amount because it's the lesser of evils in some ways, but it can have some problems, when combined with other medications. The other problem with fentanyl is it actually isn't as easy to treat. I'm sitting here telling you about buprenorphine and methadone, and that, relatively speaking, they're the best we have. They are the best we have, and they're still the best we have with fentanyl, but fentanyl is a little harder, and it's because of its biological effects on the receptor. It's so strong in terms of its getting to the receptor that it actually competes more strongly even with the buprenorphine and the methadone. So it makes it harder. And we have newer forms of fentanyl that are even stronger, that are getting out on the streets, which are terrible. And they require more Narcan in an overdose if somebody overdoses on some of these newer forms, like carfentanil is one form. So it's
Gabapentin.
So gabapentin, generally it's not nearly as dangerous. It's not an opioid. It's almost a little bit closer to like a benzodiazepine, like Valium. It's not, and it's not as addictive. The problem with it is we use it and can help with pain a little bit, but in and of itself, when it's prescribed properly, it's safe. It's when somebody takes it with other things like opioid pain medications that it can be a problem sometimes.
I've been on that.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Neuropathy.
Yeah, and it's useful for that.
Mother's on it.
Yeah, no, it's a legitimate treatment for neuropathy. Yeah, and it's not addictive. It's not something that we consider to be like a strongly addictive medication, like the opioid pain medication. The problem is when it's used with opioids, it can kind of combine and be a problem. Same with some antidepressants that are sedating, and some other medications. The more types of medications you take, the trickier it is. So, and that's where, even where I sit and I do reviews of cases where like somebody overdosed, sometimes the problem is not just the opioid they took, but if they're taking like 4 or 5 other medications, it just becomes too much. Okay. So I'll skip through this pretty fast since we're running long, but one of the things to consider with the opioid settlement money is that VIA provides services and provides some of what we'd be able to do. So we want to be able to kind of augment and work together in terms of the approaches that we take. So we've been able to distribute Narcan. I know we've distributed some in Jackson County. We're expanding our medication-assisted treatment programs, partnering with local DHHSs in some places and incarcerating settings, to try to increase access. We're increasing follow-up after substance use-related hospitalization and detox, and really focusing on that with our care management, to increase engagement after hospitalization. We're increasing recovery housing. We've gotten some funding to be able to do that. One important thing with recovery housing, and this actually used to drive me crazy when I was at Copestone too, is that much of the recovery housing doesn't allow people to take medications. And so we detox somebody, and I showed you the statistics. It's not all that effective to try to go to detox and abstinence, rather than detox and then get them on the appropriate medication for opioid use disorder and give them housing. Housing is important. That really is crucial. If somebody's unhoused, then the chances of staying clean are even lower. But so we definitely need housing support programs, but we need programs that also allow for medication treatment too at the same time. Fentanyl test strips, because fentanyl is so ever present. Some people actually don't want to be using fentanyl. Some people who use, say, methamphetamine don't want to use fentanyl, so they can actually test it and see, does this have fentanyl in it? And we're gradually trying to beef up our continuum of substance use services as part of our substance use disorder waiver.
So this fentanyl test strip, anyone could just put it in a substance, I assume with some liquid.
So and it tests to see if fentanyl is
Turn a
there.
color if
Right.
there's fentanyl.
Right.
Okay.
And the good thing, I had a presentation on one recently, they did a little webinar. You can check a variety, like, powdered substances, liquid. I mean, you can basically, any kind of substance, there's instructions for how to test
Okay.
it. Marijuana, almost anything can be tested.
Right.
And we're looking, and we're still waiting to hear about purchasing those.
Okay. And I think Don had showed a similar slide, some principles to consider for the use of the settlement funds. And I think I will stop there. I spoke much longer than I anticipated, so I'm sorry about that.
Other questions?
What time frame are we looking for those test strips to be available?
So I
We've
know,
been
we've
advocating.
been asking for them. I don't have a specific time frame, but I think we're close.
I'll find out. I had checked about a month ago when Don and I had talked about it, and we have to wait for certain funding, SOR funding, and that's how we use that funding to purchase it. So I'll try to find out. We do give. Raleigh James is on my speed dial for Narcan, the Naltrexone. I get him as much as he wants when he needs it. So we try to keep our first responders, the sheriff's office and EMS, with Narcan available so they don't have to purchase it.
Right. And they've been great. I mean, I think they really have, have embraced that because they know they're saving lives.
Got a question. What would be the average, pardon me, average salary for a manager of a program, whether it's just ballpark?
Not enough. It's part of the problem. The workforce.
Community mental health.
Yeah, community mental health it's a challenge right now with providers and with first line providers. We do best with people with lived experience, perhaps, because they're motivated to give back and to try to help others. But it really isn't enough. There's such a wide variety of programs. It's a little hard to say, but it's
More than 50,000?
if you're lucky. If you're lucky. Yeah. But it is, I think, one thing to consider is workforce, and how do we make sure that there is a workforce that can help with treatment, including really using people with lived experience, because that often, works really well because it helps keep somebody clean and motivated to keep going.
And those people get extensive training. VIA offers is called peer support specialist training. So you don't get to just have lived experience to work like in this field. I mean, some people still do, but to be hired and part of the treatment continuum and part of recovery supports, you go through training, certification, ongoing training. I mean, it's a wonderful movement. I mean, and recovery supports is as important as treatment and then the harm reduction prevention aspect. So you have that whole continuum.
Right, and then some may take it even further with training and become a certified alcohol
Like a
and substance
forensic,
abuse counselor.
mhm.
Yeah, so there are opportunities, but how do we develop this workforce even further? It's a real good issue. Yeah, and how do we pay them more? Pay them a good living to be able to support what they do. So.
I have a question about, in looking into what we have available in in Jackson County right now. And what is your knowledge about these programs as far as being evidence-based and effectiveness? We have Residential Teen Challenge, which is for men of Macon and Jackson.
And that is, what did you say?
Teen Challenge.
That's, we don't contract with them. They're a private organization.
I know.
But we can get you a list. I was going to offer as you go through this,
Okay.
every service, the providers we contract with, what they offer, who your harm reduction folks are, who is using peer support specialists.
But not just the ones you fund or work with, but what about like there, and then there's a group for females called Life Challenge. And then several churches have Celebrate Recovery.
And those are
groups.
support groups. Those are not
Okay.
treatment. It's
But
really,
now
but
Teen
I can help you
Challenge?
get that list. I can help you get that list.
Okay.
So when we talk about treatment, you're talking about like
Well, this is,
distributing
Teen
medical.
Challenge is residential.
So it's residential, and I could be wrong, but I don't know if they allow for medications for opioid use disorder. So that would be my concern. Is it data based, data driven,
Well, that's
or
why I asked.
evidence based?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that would be the key
Yeah.
is what with this money, I mean, you can spend other money other places, but what with this funding, you really need to use the evidence-based, and I can get you a list of
And some of it maybe, these aren't bad ideas like having residential treatment, but how do we
talk with them.
how do we nudge them towards using evidence-based treatment in an effective way too?
So I do think if you talk about spend money to save lives, that's when you start really breaking down those drugs as going back to that chart, right? And ultimately, the first goal is to get them basically potentially on some type of medicated treatment. That really does keep them from overdosing. I mean, when you're talking about saving lives. But then you're absolutely right, Commissioner Woody, is that there's a whole support spectrum that has to be discussed about this.
Right.
I think you'll hear eventually when we talk about if we go down to working with incarcerated individuals, it's not just about programming inside the jail. You got to have follow-up programming, and that's all support programming.
Right.
And so that's where Teen Challenge would fall in. These other
Life
there's
Challenge with
potential for
females.
partnerships with multiple organizations for that support kind of follow-up type of situation. So there is potential for the evidence-based, but you also have to have that ongoing support for addiction.
The Recovery to Work
Recovery to
program,
Work.
the council
Yep.
government, that
Yep.
is a great new program helping people with substance use disorders get connected to jobs.
Very good.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
so much. That was so helpful.
Thank you. I know that was, but I really do appreciate Dr. Zinn coming and talking to the board, because this is information now that you have, that you keep and continue to keep while we have these conversations. Are we ready to move, or do we need a break?
Let's just keep on going.
Yeah.
Okay, so next we do have Dr. Kopak. Come on up, and we're going to talk about the justice studies and research in regards to opioid substance abuse in the judicial system. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Commissioners, thanks for having me today. I just have to say it's a real pleasure to be able to come and share information with you. And by way of quick background, I was a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Western Carolina for 12 years. And in terms of lived experience, I don't have any first-person experience with substance use disorder. But my dad was a police officer for my entire adult life. He's 82. He's still with us. Still works, not as an officer now, but he's still here. And then I also have experience with substance use disorder in great detail in my personal life too, in terms of extended and very close immediate family. So I have this really unique, I think, perspective on the world where law enforcement is family, but people who use drugs are family. And yet we all get along and we understand each other quite well. And the thing about the criminal justice system is that I'm sure you're aware of is that it can get controversial really quickly when you're talking about breaking laws and public safety and protection. And so I understand all of that very well. And I try and come at this from a very objective point of view. So still having that experience and those family members, but also putting my researcher hat on. And our jobs as researchers are to remain objective. So try not to infuse our emotions and our feelings into what the data tell us, trying to let that information steer us toward the best possible decision. And whether that's driven by financial responsibilities or budgetary constraints, efficiency, or just whatever goal we're trying to achieve. So a lot of the times when I'm trying to conceive of a certain project, I think about what we're trying to achieve, and then I reverse engineer the information that we need in order to determine whether or not we've gotten to that point. And I spend, that's my day job, is looking at what we want to accomplish and how can we collect and analyze information to tell us whether or not we got there. Sometimes we might not, and that's okay, because that information will help us adapt or adjust whatever we're doing to optimize the process. So with that in mind, this information is grounded in empirical evidence, and I just sort of spared you from all the citations and the primary sources. But if any of you are interested in terms of the peer-reviewed journal articles where this information comes from, please let me know. I'm happy to share with you. And so over the course of the last, dating myself, 15 years or so, even a little bit more if you want to include graduate school, I've been studying the way in which substance use disorder interacts with the criminal justice system. And so I've seen this firsthand. I've done local projects with neighboring counties, including Jackson County, and I'll get into that, to determine what specific county needs are in terms of a substance use disorder issue and how they might handle that. But I've also looked at this in other states and other areas as well. And I've even done one international study, but that's a very different context, so we won't talk about that here. Okay, but everything from beginning, first point of contact with the criminal justice system, as I'm sure you can guess, comes in the form of a police officer. That's where it all starts. The call comes in, something has happened, we need to dispatch somebody to go and address that problem. And so what happens is that, as you see, one of the potential strategies for handling substance use disorder might be something that's called a diversion program. Okay, and diversion programs have been around a very long time. I couldn't give you an exact date of when they started, but the written information on them begins in the 1970s. Despite the fact that they have been around a long time, they've sort of developed a reputation. And the other thing I should say at the outset is that the reason that a lot of criminal justice policies and procedures can get controversial is that there's a political layer to it, right? That I'm sure none of you are aware of. I'm being sarcastic, right? But you have public officials, sheriffs, that are elected that make decisions on how programs work. Judges are elected too. Okay, so all that factors in here. So when we have a type of program, the diversion program, that gains a reputation for not being as rigid or strict or oriented toward public safety as possible, okay, some of these things are interpreted in one way or another. All right, so that's why these programs have been around quite a long time, but we don't see them all that often. However, I will have to say that they are gaining popularity as of late. There's a more widespread recognition of their capacity to keep people out of jails and get them toward a substance use treatment provider, if that's what the program is designed to do. Okay, and so the two primary goals of a lot of those, and I'm speaking in generalities here, are in fact to keep folks out of the jail. Jails can be expensive, and also the necessary treatment services may not be available in that setting, and get them toward a more appropriate clinical setting if that's the case. But the other reason that these are becoming more popular as of late is because of their ability to decrease fatal overdose. Okay. And so the idea is that if somebody has, in fact, experienced the overdose, then taking them to a detention center may not be necessarily the best possible approach in that moment. Okay. And feel free at any moment to stop me if I'm going too fast or you'd like clarification on any of this. Another point of clarification that I like to make about diversion programs is that they almost always include criminal charges and some form of deferred prosecution. So a lot of people will say, oh, it's diversion, it doesn't necessarily follow through on the type of offense that may have been committed in that moment, and therefore it isn't as appropriate as carrying through on that charge, taking somebody to the detention center. But the fact of the matter is that most, not all, but most still have that criminal charge in place. Okay, they usually operate in such a way that they hold the criminal charge, take the person to some sort of service provider, whatever that might look like in that context. And if that person engages and follows through with an individually tailored treatment plan, then that charge may be dismissed. But the fact of the matter is, it just doesn't go away. Okay. Which brings me to the next point here, is that diversion, successful ones, I should say, require the involvement of some sort of service provider. There's a lot of conversation around the phrase divert to what? And, quite frankly, I'm sure you can get on board with the idea that if we don't have a place to provide services, then what's the point in doing a diversion program? And to that, I would say that is a logical rationale. So there's got to be something available for folks that have substance use related needs. Okay. The really neat thing about diversion programs, again, going back to the idea that the first point of contact can serve as that decision point in whether or not or how to address somebody's substance use related needs, can come literally on the sidewalk. It can come at somebody's home if that's where an EMS professional or law enforcement officer is dispatched. So again, that decision, again, it can be made right there in the field. And all of this would just simply revert back to what that program is designed to do and how it's structured. The neat thing about this sort of current wave of diversion programs, if you will, is related to how they can connect with people in different ways. Okay, so there is a type of program that's known as a self-referral program, and the most current version of this actually started in Gloucester, Massachusetts, near the Cape Cod, and so the leaders of the local police agency up there were seeing all the overdose-related incidents in the community and had to do something essentially immediately. And so what they did is they completely reoriented the way that they would engage with this population. And they said, come to the police station. We're not going to charge you with an offense, and we will connect you with the folks that can, in fact, give you a helping hand. And they have seen such tremendous response to this. But if you think about this, right, going back to the conversations that we've already had about the amount of stigma that's involved in this and how people will hide their substance use because they're ashamed of it, especially in a small community, especially in SOFA and Jackson County, right? I know I sure would hide my substance use if that were the case because I wouldn't want anybody knowing about it. But then to approach, imagine coming in the sheriff's office front door and asking for help. I mean, that's radical. It can be done, though. There are other places that are doing this. But it involves a pretty significant shift in the way that we think about how law enforcement is viewed in the community and getting people with substance use disorder to trust that this process will not harm them further. if they were to approach. There's another one called active outreach, and this would probably be best served by a program with community health workers or a peer support specialist, because it actually involves people going out in the community, obviously the outreach part, but to homes and visiting with people, spending time and finding out what their needs might be in a given scenario, and offering them access to services in a very low pressure sort of situation. And so it's essentially built on rapport and a community connection that can help people to come and be willing to engage with a service provider when that time is right.
Can I ask a question, Dr. Kilbeck? When, with this diversion and it's, talking about diverting people to the appropriate agency, does that have to be at their agreement? Can they, be made to go? Just like, you don't have a choice about going to jail. Are these diversion programs required by, can they be, or does it have to be their choice to do it?
Both. They can operate in both ways. Yeah. I've seen, so there's a diversion program that operates in Florida where law enforcement officer has probable cause to make an arrest. So already that's aside. They could literally put the handcuffs on and take the person to the detention center at that point. However, that particular program offers a choice that if the person admits guilt and signs the citation there on the sidewalk, they will not be taken into custody. But again, the criminal charge is recorded, and that person has to report to the service provider. The service provider then monitors this person's treatment plan. In that case, it's 90 days. And at the completion of that 90-day period, if all of those conditions are met, then that service provider sends a notice, and that citation is not filed in the state arrest record system. That's one way. But then there's, on the other side, folks that are in fact charged with the offense. They appear in front of the judge. The judge decides, instead of sending you to the detention center for 30 days, I'm going to give you a sentence of reporting to this provider and carrying out the conditions that they establish for your plan. And I would say the latter scenario very closely resembles something like a probation program. So very similar in a lot of regards, just that the diversion program for somebody with substance use disorder would have a heavier treatment component, if you will. Yeah.
Which has a better success rate?
Here's my researcher hat. Flip a coin. The success rate is about 50%. And to which I would say is that a given person's needs should be tailored to the type of program that's available. And that gets kind of into the weeds, so to speak. But not all programs are best for all people, what it comes down to. So in addition to the active outreach, several diversion programs take advantage of overdose response incidents. And so at that time, when a person experiences a resuscitation at the time of near fatal overdose, they can be offered or inducted into a certain kind of diversion program. We heard about the 911 Good Samaritan laws and these kinds of things. So under that framework, those types of programs have proliferated. And we also have the officer referral, which I gave a scenario of officer offering citation if that system is in place versus officer arresting and taking to the service provider. So that's the difference between the prevention and intervention as it relates to an officer-initiated entry to the program. And this last bullet point is, as you can see, the top priority of diversion programs is addressing substance use and mental health conditions for the population they're designed for. And that's what makes them different than a traditional community supervision program like a probation or a parole, as we sort of know them in a more traditional sense. Mm-hmm.
So on diversion programs, we mentioned law enforcement, but is it safe to say, I don't want to make this assumption, it's the reason I'm asking, that you'd also need, say, the district attorney's office and potentially the judicial system, judges, and potentially, especially with reoffenders, probation, there would need to be coordination in the diversion program that takes place with those entities also. I mean, when you've seen successful programs, it wasn't just law enforcement, correct? Mm-hmm. It's the whole system that needs to kind of be on the same page. Is that a correct assumption?
That's absolutely correct. Right. So you'd have to have the endorsement of state's attorney's office, because if you're talking about withholding charges and changing the nature of how that criminal process functions, you would need the input from all the key stakeholders. Mm-hmm.
And just make sure I'm clear on this, and you may have stated this, and please forgive me for re-asking it. Diversion programs are for what kind of substance abuse?
So, as all of them, is the easiest answer I can give.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know sort of we're focusing more on the opioids here, but it could be someone who's drunk, or it could be someone on methamphetamine, or it could be somebody on another form of drugs. That this diversion could be diverted.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'd say the most relevant category here is for the overdose reversal type of program. That's going to be the most prominent sort of diversion for the current scenario with opioid and fentanyl adulterated drugs. Yeah.
And here again, this is just this is pre-arrest diversion. Mm-hmm. So an officer encounters someone in the community that's committed a crime. Possibly that's the reason why they've encountered them. And they make this determination that this person is on a substance. I mean, walk me through how that works, because it is, to me, it could be a very complicated process for an officer to have to make this evaluation and determine how does an officer do that?
That's a great question, one that I'm not experienced enough to answer, but those are the mechanics of these types of programs, where you're asking somebody with the experience of addressing those types of scenarios to make that judgment call at that moment. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, because the reason I'm saying this, we talk about it's tough to recruit people now to just do regular law enforcement jobs, and then when you add this another layer, and it becomes much more complex, they're also taking on a role where they're having to have some experience and understanding of how to very effectively and to look at someone and say, well, this is what's happening, and to make this judgment. And I know I can remember with VIA, I remember having, help me with this, there was some training for law enforcement officers. Do you remember that presentation we had?
I know what you're talking about.
There's training, VIA went through this whole process where what was it? CIT, that's right. I was trying to remember that. So critical intervention training, mm-hmm. where you train officers to recognize, well, this person is not on their medication. And if this person were in their right state of mind and we're not on this, then they know that that's why they're doing what they're doing. for a simplistic way of stating this. And so I'm going to help them with the problem instead of arresting them, taking them to jail. It's a level of training that you're expecting. If we were to do something like this, then our community would have to embrace, and it would be a new whole standard for our officers.
And
Well, one thing that could happen, as a teacher over the years, I taught over a 40-year span. I didn't teach all those years. I did some other things. But in that 40 years of being in the educational system, more and more things were added to our plate. And we got more and more trainings. And then the issue is, as soon as you have a new teacher, you've got to retrain because they weren't there before, or they moved from another school or system or whatever. So one of the things that was effective was to have one point person who evaluated those kinds of things, instead of every teacher being expected to have the skills to diagnose, which is really what it is in a sense.
right, so
You call in this expert. But I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's multi-layered, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It sure is.
yeah, some agencies have developed a co-responder model. So they'll have a law enforcement unit that actually has a trained mental health professional that will respond to certain calls. Because what happens in smaller communities, probably like ours, would be that if a call comes in from a certain area, address, what have you, is that there's probably an educated guess at what might be happening or who might be involved. And so there might already be some primary knowledge about what they're walking into. And so in that case, if there was a specific unit, the mental health unit, if we want to call it this, it could be whatever we conceive of, and they're dispatched to those types of incidents. So that model is gaining popularity also. All right. So switch from pre-arrest diversion to jail settings. And I'll preface this discussion here with the brief introduction or overview of the work that I've been involved with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office for the last longer than I was supposed to because of COVID. So just prior to COVID arriving, we started collecting information downstairs about the behavioral health needs of folks that are processed into the detention center. And it's ongoing. We've getting back up to speed, if you will. And so that information is still rolling in. But the fact of the matter is that our detention center operates as a de facto behavioral health hub because, and I can share these numbers once we get more folks interviewed. I just want to make sure that they're as stable as they can be before I do distribute them. But looking at the types of behavioral health conditions in the population that is processed into the detention center shows you just the magnitude and the complexity of these needs. And I would also be hard-pressed to be convinced that this isn't the group of people with the greatest need in the community. It's those that pass through those doors. So just as a background, I want to put that in place. There has been some recent information, and this comes out of national level data that's aggregated across all jails. And right now there's about 2,900 jails in the United States. So you have to take that for what it's worth. But the fact of the matter is that when deaths in custody happen, they involve health complications. More often than not, one of those health complications is substance use disorder. And to make matters worse, it's usually a smaller detention center because they're more likely to be under-resourced. And so if you have a larger center with a full-blown medical staff, for example, those medical needs can be triaged upon admission. So it's almost like thinking of the detention center as some sort of emergency health department. But the fact is, it's not designed for that, right? It's designed to take somebody who is conceivably committed a crime and remove them from a situation in order to protect other people. That's what the jail is for. But people who are ill and with an array of medical conditions as are processed into this this facility, they do need the treatment and the services in order to stabilize them. So with this in mind, it does serve as an intervention point, and it is an opportunity. And I know that not all people think that way, but when you do have somebody that is coming into the facility, the fact of the matter is that a lot of people will look for help. They've usually reached the lowest point in their life as of late, and they're willing to open themselves up to doing something different. We did, in fact, do a small research study in a neighboring county asking folks as they were admitted to the jail what they needed in order to treat their substance use. And we got a whole bunch of different kinds of responses. But everybody was so candid. And a lot of people would cry because mothers wanted their children back. And so it represents a vulnerable point at which people are receptive to getting help. But then when they're released, more often than not, right, they go back to the cold, hard world, so to speak, and kind of do what they need to survive. And so it's that time during detention that can be capitalized in order to engage people with treatment. And so for people with opioid use disorder, medication, like we heard from Dr. Zen, can be that sort of linchpin to get people stabilized. One thing I would encourage folks to think about is that stabilizing recent arrestees on medication can also help with not only with reducing the likelihood of a fatal outcome in the detention center, but also in terms of misconduct. And so promoting the safety and the well-being of that person, but also the correctional center staff. It can just sort of create a more stable environment as much as it can be when you have the type of correctional setting that is characteristic of jails. Okay.
Do we offer medical treatment in our jail? Drugs, medical, the MOUDs?
As far as I know, we do not.
Wow. Downstairs?
Yeah.
No. We do not have an MAT program. What they end up doing is they end up treating we do have a contract for medical services, okay? But they end up treating the symptoms if someone came in and was going through withdrawal and so forth, they treat the symptoms, but we don't have a MAT program for the jail at this point.
So there are some detention centers in the region. In the region, I mean our westernmost 16, that if somebody is admitted to the jail and has a prescription for MOUD, and that prescription can be verified, it will be continued during the detention period. There are others further east that will induct people. They'll start people on medication after admission, even if they did not have a prescription prior to jail admission. So 2 different approaches, both require different resources in terms of a physician on staff and training and monitoring the distribution of the medication with correctional officers. So there are different policies, procedures, and protocols that have to be followed in the secure area within the jail in order to do this.
So, and I don't want to jump too far ahead of Dr. Kopak's presentation, but there's going to be a reentry portion of this conversation. So when you start looking at the jail population group, there's really two issues there. One is a service inside the jail, okay, whether it be an assessment when they come in, full mental health assessment, and some type of MAT or MOUD. They remember MAT is the old acronym. But then there's a whole program portion of this conversation that is about what happens when they leave the jail. Because if the point is to try to assist somebody in recovery, then you really need to also develop, at the same time that you're developing a jail MOUD or MAT program, we need to also be having conversations about what happens when they re-enter. Otherwise, they just literally just go out, don't get the treatment anymore, reoffend, and we're back in the same situation. So I believe there's an opportunity when we start talking about any of our programming. It is always about trying, how do we access or provide access to people who need treatment? Well, this is literally and figuratively a captured audience. So there's some, when you look at it in that term, and this audience, this population group that we're talking about, generally they're not in a silo by themselves, meaning they generally are having social and human services issues that we are dealing with outside of a criminal justice system. So whether it be through social services or through some of our human services programming, it's not just, a lot of times it's not just about that individual who's in the jail setting, it's also about the other issues in the family setting that we're dealing with. So obviously this needs to be something that the board needs to make decisions on in the future if this is a priority, but this would be, for lack of better terms, a low-hanging fruit, an item that you don't have to build a lot of other systems. Like the reason my point about the diversion program. The diversion program, this isn't a qualitative comment about good or bad. It's about, you have to bring in multiple organizations to be on the same page for a diversion program. A lot of planning, a lot of cohesion, things of that nature, versus when you deal with inside the jail setting, it really is us and the sheriff obviously trying to work something out. And also a provider that would help us when you look at reentry.
And the reason I'm saying this, I'm focusing more on the incarceration period. Because number one, we know that there are a lot of people who come into the jail who are already high. And are there ways, and here, this is, like I said, getting beyond my scope of knowledge, how are we dealing with inmates who come in already high on a substance? Are we administering Naltrexone or Narcan? Are we doing something to eliminate the high, eliminate the effects of the drug? Secondly, there are withdrawals. If we're all of a sudden this person is cut off, then they're going to have a different behavior than someone who was not on a substance, going through withdrawals in this addiction process. So how can you make that inmate population more stable? Can it be through the process of MATs or MOUDs or however you want to characterize it? And then the other aspect is, which we all don't want to admit, but it's a reality, that on occasion, substances find their way into detention centers. And that has been common all across this state and nation, and has even happened here locally, and where people all of a sudden become high or under the influence of a substance while they're been incarcerated. So how do we deal with that? And that's why I'm asking this question. What happens afterwards? Yes, we need to focus on being able to take this captive audience and deal with long-term strategies and hopefully start a program that moves on once they leave our custody. But even from a liability arrangement, how can we de-escalate, reduce liability, reduce problems in the jail? It could be very simple that we're administering drugs.
Blockers.
Yeah. To answer your first couple of questions, no, if they come in and they're going through withdrawal symptoms, they're treating them with Tylenol. They're treating the symptoms, the hangover, the withdrawal. They're not treating it with a MOUD or MAT program. And then second, I believe, Dr. Kopak, you basically just stated that I think one of your statements was that it allows for this type of treatment program would increase safety and things of that nature. I believe that's your second point, because if they're coming down off of a high and things of that nature, that increases liability issues, safety issues, and I believe that was your statement. So on those couple of issues, we're treating these symptoms, and yes, a program like this could assist in doing more than just treating the symptoms, but basically getting them on a treatment that's better than just treating the symptoms. And then I still think long term, you still got to figure out how to deal with them
True.
when
Absolutely.
when they re-enter. Yes.
Doctor, is there a contract service provider out there that would come into jail, excuse me, be educated to recognize and distribute MOUDs in a jail, in a detention setting?
I'm not sure if the county's contractor does provide this service.
So that needs to be a conversation for a different meeting, but that would be the method that we would need to do this. And so, but again, it comes down to finding the provider that can provide the service themselves, this particular service. And at this point, the county and the newly elected sheriff would need to make a decision to move forward in these conversations. And then for us, if you choose to do so, then we would start investigating that question.
For years, Lewis Beck with the health department, nurse practitioner, provided the services for the jail.
See,
Because
that's,
I worked there at that time, and
that's what I'm thinking.
but
What-
he retired. But that is a good question to know.
Exactly. What about a
Yeah.
social worker or somebody that would have knowledge of this stuff to maybe,
Well, that's
I mean,
what
we're
we talked
getting
about.
this
having
opioid
this-
money. Why can't we open up a whole nother,
Treatment.
not a treatment, but an application for employment for this person to take over this
Yeah.
this department of taking care of the jail inmates when they are, or if there's problems out in the field, they go out in the field and, you know, a whole new person to take care of this situation that we're going through.
But, and I agree, all that's open for conversation, but obviously, I think where we need to be is the newly elected sheriff comes on board, if that's a priority, and if it's a priority of this board, it would have to be a partnership conversation
Correct.
between those entities. And then if it's a choice to move forward with this type of programming, then what I recommend is that you allow the staff and the professional to go through and look to see if it's best served by a professional contract or best served by an individual. All that would be discussed and decided after, if and when this board and the newly elected sheriff chooses to move forward with some type of MOUD or MAT program.
Correct. Okay.
I'm just thinking if it's somebody from our county, they're gonna care more about the people than some company that's out of Asheville that, you got some guy driving over here, it's, you know, he's not gonna have a love for our community like our people that live here.
Okay.
A statistic, if you have the data, in a rural setting like ours, in our neighboring counties, what percent, and this, I won't hold you to it, would you think they are people in our detention centers with substance abuse issues?
Oh, I could, again, I do have concrete percentages on that. And I'm the one that enters the data, but I just haven't looked at it in a few weeks. We have about 220 interviews completed. And at that point, about 2/3 of that 225 meet diagnostic criteria for one substance use disorder or another. That's lumping everything together.
It's a lot.
And about 1/3 of that is opioid use. About a larger percentage are positive for methamphetamine use, unfortunately. So it is more prominent.
As Commissioner Dietz, excuse me, as earlier said, the urgency that we feel in our community is obvious to all of us, and that it just jumps out at me hearing your comments that is with that statistic just then, that might be a strong way to look into on a sooner than later program.
Well, I can remember Sheriff Hall giving us a report that 80% of the crime in Jackson County was came back to drug abuse. And or alcohol, which is the drug, but that it wasn't maybe necessarily using or selling, but it was theft, larceny, to get money, to buy the drugs, domestic violence, child abuse, all those things. And they all go back 80% of crime. So this addressing this would certainly provide some safety in our community.
Sure.
What is a 30-day prescription for, say, Suboxone for one person? What does that 30-day box of that cost? Do you know?
I honestly don't know. But I would caution you, or I guess encourage you to think about this in terms of the average length of stay in the jail, because the average is 2 weeks.
Average is 2 weeks.
And that's according to the information that I have. The sheriff's office could give you the exact, because we only have a sample of the total population that passes through. And so it represents a set of challenges. That opportunity remains because folks are there. But again, it's an abbreviated period of time where by the time you get somebody stabilized, it could be time for them to disappear. And sometimes those releases are pretty immediate. If somebody were to appear at court, for example, and charges are dismissed or something gets resolved, they could be free to walk out at that moment. And that point of connection has been lost. And so while it does, again, represent that opportunity, it's difficult to manage. It's brief and and forging a firm connection is hard. The right kind of person, I think, needs to do it, just like you were mentioning earlier.
Wow. Yeah.
All right. Perfect segue to reentry programs. So what we're doing over the detention center is something that is not done routinely in many detention centers anywhere, especially those of smaller size and in settings like ours that are more rural. So what we do is when somebody comes in, and we have a volunteer student from Western that conducts these interviews, and she's a senior this year. And so she'll come over and she'll look at the list of people who have been booked into the jail, and she'll start approaching them one by one and asking them if they want to participate, if they want to do this interview, talk about prior substance use, behavioral health needs. This usually takes about 45 minutes, but at the end of this, we have what it amounts to specific diagnoses that could serve as a referral to a service provider. And this is unique because a lot of this work with jail populations is based on very loose reports of prior substance use, and by that I mean, have you used drugs in the past? Well, I think we could all say yes, right, to some degree or another, if we were put on medication and being truthful about it. Or the other way that we tend to collect this information is through whether or not they've been told by a medical professional that they have a substance use problem. Well, the major issue with this is that a lot of our folks don't have healthcare coverage. And if they did, again, the shame that surrounds substance use is likely to make them reluctant to go seek help for it. And so it may be the fact that they do have substance use disorder, but they weren't told by a medical professional, so they didn't have treatment or access. And they've used, but to what level is this? And so when we're trying to create and generate a diagnosis, we want as much information as possible. And so going back to Dr. Zinn's conversation, if you're told you have diabetes, right, and you don't know what the severity or the type of that condition is, you don't necessarily know how to treat that properly. And so substance use disorder is the same. You can have a mild, you can have a moderate. Unfortunately, most of the folks in the detention center either have none or severe, and that's at the upper end of the spectrum. And then, of course, that would be used in order to develop an appropriate treatment plan. And there's a whole level of care that exists. The American Society of Addiction Medicine says that if you have this severity of this type of substance use disorder, then these types of treatments should be considered. And it's something of a roadmap. It's not to be followed exactly because there are variations in it. But all of this hinges back to that diagnostic assessment. Because we don't have that concrete information, we can't make educated decisions about what kind of treatment to provide. And so everything should be linked to this. And the reentry process should start immediately because of that very brief time in the detention center. Some folks may be in and out in 3 days. So they might not even be finished with their withdrawal. They may not even be stabilized, and they may be on their way out already. But at the same time, as somebody has that 3, maybe even 4 week window, then that time should be used wisely. Is kind of the way that I see this, and get folks connected. The continuity of care, like Mr. Adams is saying, involves this idea of having somebody with a place to go and a person to connect with at the time that they walk out the door. And that's difficult to do. It's sort of easy to say, but complicated to implement because it involves a service provider. And jumping ahead here for a second, the likelihood of having a peer support specialist who's from the community or a community health worker who has navigated this process in the past with lived experience, knowing which service providers may be most able to help in a given situation, tend to be the most successful pieces of those kinds of programs. I do have a note here about the idea of having an individually tailored reentry model, because some folks will be motivated to go to an abstinence-based program, but that may not work for all folks. And especially as we discussed earlier, the idea that some residential facilities may or may not allow medication of any type. So that all needs to be taken into consideration in this person's reentry plan. But the sort of bottom line through all of this is that those community-based services are imperative. And just one real quick story. My first cousin, his name is George, he was arrested for misdemeanor theft down in South Florida. He was living in the Keys at the time. He stole some fishing poles. He got arrested. The reason that he took those poles is because he wanted to sell them to get some heroin because he was in active opioid use. He was admitted to the Miami-Dade jail, and at the time of release, he said, I want to go to a treatment provider. Get me a bed. I want to get clean right now. And so they said, we don't have one. You're basically on your own. So his sister came up, met with him, took him to a hotel to sort of wait out that period and make sure that he could get into a residential treatment facility. But she got sick, so she had to leave. And the only thing he had was his phone. So he went and he sold his phone, and he got fentanyl adulterated dose of heroin, and he died with the needle in his arm. And I'm convinced that if there was some sort of system, some sort of reentry program in place, that could have just, it didn't have to have a residential treatment facility. It didn't have to be some kind of full-blown comprehensive health provider, but even just somebody from nearby that was interested in spending the time with him, that maybe that could have changed the outcome of that story. And so it's really neat. I think we have a fantastic opportunity here to fill a gap that currently exists, especially for the folks that are in the detention center. So if there's anything that I covered here that you'd like more detail on, feel free to let me know. I can send you all the peer-reviewed articles you could ever imagine if you're interested. And one last take-home point, I think, that if I could offer would be that whatever the commission decides to do, I just strongly encourage that you track how well this works. Because as Commissioner Woody mentioned, there has not been, I don't want to say there isn't any, but there's very little evidence for what works best in small communities. It just doesn't exist because most small communities don't have the resources to collect that data and monitor progress. But I think, again, there's an opportunity to do some of that and follow how well this works. So,
Question, if I may, is there any data that shows a success on the reward component to encourage treatment after being released from detention center?
so that is it's still kind of growing in. I would classify that as the contingency management type of program, the one that we heard about earlier that offers a financial incentive for providing negative urinalysis tests and reporting for appointments and that kind of thing. And yeah, the short answer is yes, there's preliminary evidence to show that. And I say preliminary because a lot of the current work in that area is like smartphone app based. And so it introduces another element. So if you don't have people receive the phones or the technology to be able to access the reward or even the program, then they've already been disqualified from it.
If we did some program and wanted to collect data, which I think would be very good to do, would MAHEC be a possible partner in that with the data?
They sure would, yeah. Full disclosure that when I left the university in May, I took a job. My title now is research scientist, and I am employed by MAHEC now. But I remain objective as can be. I don't plug their services or, work any more closely with any one of their clinics than the other. But yes, that's something that we do. There's two of us over. There's two research scientists over there, and that's what we do. We design research projects to collect what it is that a particular program wants to learn.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Appreciate your patience with us,
Yeah.
with Dr. Zen, and your time with us today.
No problem. And I apologize for being so long-winded.
No, excellent. We
Very
probably
good.
might want you back to ask you some questions as we explore, go down the road.
Yes?
Well, yep. I'm not sure if I mentioned at the outset, but I've lived in Silva. We moved here in 2010, and we don't plan on going anywhere. Yeah. So anything I can do to help the community is something that gives me gratification. So,
Yes, sir.
all right.
Thank
you
so much.
Good?
Yeah.
The last couple of things, all right. We do have Ms. Ash here to talk about a resolution. Let's, taxpayers list their personal property electronic.
Change course completely.
Right into property tax. So with our new software, one of the things I was most excited for was doing electronic listing for personal property. We can also hopefully at some point do online appeals and a lot of different variety of things. But electronic listing, we have to have a resolution that is by law. So that is what I'm here to present today. It basically just allows people to go onto a site and list their boats or whatever they have electronically without having to fill out the paper and mail it in or bring it by. And if you could, I guess I can I? Nope. I got an example. Oh, there we go. This is Ashe County's example. So this will be the site. You'd get your account number and this information off of the form. If it'll let me. Can you click continue? Logged us out. It's been a couple hours since we plugged it in.
You've been so patient. Thank you.
All right. So it's real simple. You just pop up, have your name, information. You can add phone numbers, change your address. Then when you go down here, you click sold. Whatever, if you still got the vote, you just affirm it and go on with your day. So it's as quick as that. You can just go down here and hit submit. So after you filled out the contact information. So it's very simple, very easy, and I'm hoping it will help us get a lot more people just to list. Because one of the complaints we have is mailing.
How are you making things so easy?
Well, you want people to list. A lot of people complain about the postage and things like that. So We do allow people to submit faxes, but a lot of times they're very hard to read. Same thing with scanned copies. So this just make it a whole lot easier. If you still got it, you go down and fill it out, and sign it, and then you're on your way. So
Would I submit to you an email and you just send me my listing notice? How would the listing notice?
you're still going to get the listing notice like normal in the mail. Yes, and then it would have the information on there, and all you have to do is go to the site and put in the information you need and submit whatever you got there. You can go in and add acquisitions if it's a business. You can go in and do an extension request in January. Just try to make it as easy as possible. So I'll have to change a couple things on my ad that goes in the paper, but other than that, it's just a resolution to allow us to do that.
What about some senior citizens who may not have a computer?
They can still do it like normal. They can come in, we can accept it on mail, whatever works for you. You don't have to do it this way. It's just another option. So yeah, we'll still take it any other way you got. As long as you list, we're okay with it. We're just trying to make it easier.
I wasn't talking about myself. I do have a computer.
I didn't say anything.
Do you have any concerns or questions about it? Well, we'll place it on the agenda.
All right, thank you.
Actually, we do have Ms. Henry here to talk about a topic that the board had already voted upon, and I'll just turn it over to Ms. Henry.
Good evening. I will make this short and sweet. Thought you would appreciate that. So essentially, Mr. Adams came before the board back about a month ago to ask if we could get the board's approval to go forward with a building reuse grant with the Department of Commerce for American Sewing. And so we're ready to take that step forward. We've got the resolution prepared here. And so essentially what we're hoping for is to put this on the agenda for next week's meeting and allow approval to sign the resolution and then the application so that we can submit that to Raleigh. I can give you background or answer questions, but it's kind of nothing has changed since Mr. Adams talked to you guys about it back in August. So essentially this is a business that's expanding, about 12,000 square feet, a little over $2 million in capital and property.
Tiffany, you may want to mention the match that's part of this.
Yes, and so that was the other part that we talked about, or Mr. Adams talked about, was the match. So as a requirement for the Commerce Grant, there is a 5% match. Since the benefit amount is $60,000, it would be $3,000 match requirement for us, and we will be using that in basically an agreement with Mountain West Partnership. They will be administering and overseeing this grant. And Mountain West Partnership, they are a part of Southwestern Commission, for those of you that aren't.
That's a great investment to get 12 permanent jobs. That's good.
Yeah. And there will be, I'm excited. I think that's one of the things that I'm really trying to work on is helping our existing businesses make sure that they are aware of opportunities like this, taking advantage of them and helping them grow. So,
With an average wage of $18 an hour.
mm-hmm.
Nice.
And they actually will be adding more than those 12 jobs, but they are what this commerce requires, that minimum, that $37,000. So there will be more, but the requirement for this grant is the 12 jobs at that wage, or that $37,000. So, does anybody have any questions for me? Do you have anything to add?
If the board chooses to move forward with this, then I will be presenting it to you Tuesday.
Yes.
Any questions or concerns?
Who manages that now?
So his name is Kyle Core,
What?
Core, Coar, and then Clemmy is still down there working.
Is he?
Mm-hmm. But Kyle's the owner.
And that $18 an hour job does it doesn't include benefits, but do they offer benefits?
They do, and that is also a requirement of this grant. They have to have benefits.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
I wondered that.
This grant, the way they follow through, they check this through their quarterly payroll reports and things of that nature. So all of this information is verified through the grant process.
How many does the plant up on Scotch Creek Road, how many they employ?
Home tech, that's changed and that's moved a lot, ebb and flowed. I don't know the current number, but last time I think they were around 20.
How many?
Around 20.
Yeah, I couldn't do much more than that.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Could you remind me where this is located?
This is on the back side of Jackson Paper. What's the name of the street? Yeah.
Ashley Kelly.
Okay.
I can't remember the name of that street. I was going to say
Harold Street.
It is Harold Street.
I was going to
yes.
say Harold or Hamilton Street. I can't
Thank
remember.
you.
So Yeah.
Because during COVID, I think what used to be Webster Enterprises used it for a bit to make masks, didn't they?
no, they actually did
Oh, they made the masks. Okay.
And Webster Enterprises did too.
Okay.
Lots of textile
Okay.
industries.
They
That
did
was
really
their
fast,
shift.
yeah.
To PPE.
Till we found out that the cloth wasn't so effective. But it's okay. It was better than none.
Any questions or concerns? All right, we'll add this to the agenda as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Other business?
I have, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Deets, anything today?
No.
Commissioner Woody?
No.
Commissioner Jones?
Sir.
Commissioner Strickland? I would like to add, ask that we, at a future work session, talk a little bit about affordable housing again. I know we have the committee, it's staff-driven. I'd like to at least get an update, maybe talk about future opportunities, maybe include, because after mentioning that, I've had some phone calls and requests for citizens to be maybe a part of that, or other organizations to be a part of that committee. I just feel like we've got so much being asked of us about affordable housing and opportunities that I'd like to sort of get an idea of where we're at, what kind of work's been done, and maybe strategize about what we can do in the future. So I'd like that to be a work session topic in the future. Any other things? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.